The morning Eleanor Whitfield decided to disappear, snow was falling on Beacon Street like ash from a quiet sky. December had settled over Boston with the kind of cold that seeps through wool and stockings and finds the bone underneath. In the kitchen of the Pemberton townhouse, 3 floors below the chandeliers and the imported Persian rugs, Eleanor knelt on the slate floor and scrubbed a cast-iron pot with steel wool until her knuckles bled. She was 22 years old. She had been doing this work for 10 years. Above her, the house was waking. She could hear her cousin Cordelia laughing somewhere near the music room and the heavy footfall of Aunt Margaret coming down the main staircase. The kettle on the stove had begun its low, sad whistle, and Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and reached for it without looking. She knew this kitchen the way other young women knew their lovers. She knew which floorboard near the pantry creaked, which cupboard hinge needed oil, which step she could skip when her aunt was sleeping. She knew the bones of this house, and the house had known her bones in return, and neither of them loved the other. She had not always lived in the basement. Once, a long time ago, there had been a small house on Joy Street, with a green door and a window box where her mother grew lavender. There had been a father who came home from Harvard each evening with botanical samples wrapped in handkerchiefs and ink stains on his cuffs. There had been a mother who sang while she cooked, who read poems aloud, who pinned wildflowers in Eleanor's hair before church. There had been laughter in that small house. There had been a name spoken with love: Eleanor. Then there had been a wet October night in 1865, and a carriage that overturned on Storrow Drive, and a constable at the door with his hat in his hands. After that, there had been only this: the basement, the aunt, the cousins who rolled their eyes when she entered a room and laughed when she left it, the uncle, now dead, who had signed papers Eleanor never saw and emptied accounts she never knew existed. 10 years of being told in 1,000 small ways that she was nothing. She finished the pot and set it on the drying rack. The clock above the stove read 7 minutes past 6. By 1/2 she would carry the breakfast tray up to her aunt's bedroom. By 8 she would be back in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes. By 10 she would be in the parlor with the silver polish. By noon she would be lighting the fires upstairs in preparation for whatever ladies her aunt had invited for the afternoon. That afternoon, the tea. Eleanor had nearly forgotten. Her hands paused on the apron strings. There was going to be a tea this afternoon, and Aunt Margaret had hinted in the way that her aunt always hinted that an announcement might be made about Eleanor's future, about the gentleman who had been suggested. Edwin Thatcher, 62 years old, 3 wives buried, none of them past 40, hands that were always cold and always damp. He had visited the house twice in the last month, and on both occasions Eleanor had served the tea and pretended not to notice the way his eyes followed her across the parlor. He smelled of liniment and something sweeter underneath something medicinal, something that she could not name but did not like. Aunt Margaret had told her last week, with the brisk tone she reserved for unpleasant household matters, that Mr. Thatcher was prepared to be generous, that a girl in Eleanor's situation could not afford to be particular, that January would be a fitting month for a wedding, and that Eleanor should be grateful, very grateful that anyone at all was willing to take her off her aunt's hands. She thought of Mr. Thatcher's cold hands and her stomach turned. The hours passed the way they always did, in the rhythm of small invisible labors. She carried the breakfast tray upstairs. She washed the dishes. She polished the silver. She laid the fires in the parlor and the music room and the formal dining room. She set out the good china, the rosewood cake stand, The small porcelain dishes for the cucumber sandwiches Cordelia would not eat anyway. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, and the family moved through her like air. By 2 in the afternoon, the ladies had begun to arrive. Mrs. Endicott with her son's new fiancé, Mrs. Lowell, who had been widowed 3 times and seemed proud of it, old Mrs. Cabot, who could not hear and who shouted everything. Eleanor counted 12 in all. She brought the tea service to the parlor and set it carefully on the long mahogany table, and then she retreated, as she always retreated, to stand behind the lacquered Chinese screen near the window. From there she could see and not be seen. From there she would wait until her aunt rang the small silver bell, and she would come forward to refill the cups, and then she would retreat again. She had become very good at retreating. The ladies talked about hats. They talked about the new gas lamps on Commonwealth Avenue. They talked about Mrs. Lowell's recent journey to Newport. Then gradually, the way these things always come, the conversation turned to marriages, Cordelia's prospects, Beatrice's reluctance to settle, the strange business of the Adams girl who had eloped with her music teacher, and then Aunt Margaret laughed her short, brittle laugh and said something that made Eleanor go very still behind the screen. "Eleanor, my dear, well, what can one say? My poor sister's child. A burden, really, and I do not say that to be unkind, only to be honest. Plain as a fence post. No dowry, no accomplishments to speak of. I have been trying for 10 years to find someone willing to take her, and at last I have managed it. Edwin Thatcher has agreed. Yes, I know 3 wives in the ground, but at his age, what does it matter? He needs someone to keep his house. Eleanor will do well enough. She is at least useful, which is more than I can say for some young women these days." The ladies tittered. Polite, soft laughter, the sort that felt like small pins. Behind the screen, Eleanor closed her eyes. She had heard her aunt say cruel things before. She had heard herself called plain and dull and unmarriageable. She had heard her own name spoken like an inconvenience, but she had never heard it spoken to strangers in a public room with that careless, almost amused tone, as if Eleanor were a piece of furniture being haggled over at an estate sale. A burden. The word sat in her chest like a stone. And in that moment, standing behind a painted screen in a house that had never been hers, listening to women she had served for years, laugh at the small, sad joke of her existence, Eleanor Whitfield felt something inside her that had been bending for 10 years finally break. She did not weep. She did not move. She stood very still and let the conversation wash over her, and when at last the silver bell rang, she came forward to refill the cups. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing. She had 10 years of practice at showing nothing. She refilled Mrs. Lowell's cup and Mrs. Endicott's cup and old Mrs. Cabot's cup, and she did not look once at her aunt, and her aunt did not look once at her, and the ladies talked on. But behind her eyes, something was moving. She had a box, hidden under a loose floorboard in the corner of her basement room beneath the cot where she slept. She had not opened it in 3 days. She had been waiting perhaps for some sign, for some moment when she would know that the time had come. She had not believed the moment would ever come. And now it had come in the ridiculous form of a parlor full of women drinking weak tea, and Eleanor knew with a clarity that startled her that she would be gone from this house before sunrise. That night, in the long blue hours after the ladies had gone home and the dishes had been washed and the lamps in the parlor had been turned down, Eleanor went to her basement room and locked the door. She knelt on the cold floor and pried up the loose board with her fingernails, and she lifted out the wooden box that had been her secret for almost a year. Inside lay everything she owned that mattered. Her father's botanical journal, leather bound the cover worn to softness at the corners. 8 letters tied with string addressed in a strong masculine hand to Miss Eleanor Whitfield, care of the post office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her grandmother's pearl earrings wrapped in silk. A small silver cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother. A ticket envelope from the Boston and Albany Railroad. $87 in folded notes, the result of many small economies and one quiet trip to a pawnbroker on Hanover Street. She read the last letter again, though she knew it by heart. Miss Whitfield, it began in handwriting that slanted forward like a man walking into wind. The arrangements you describe meet with my approval. I will meet you at the station in Stillwater Creek. Look for a tall man in a dark coat and a brown hat. My brothers and I will see you safely home from there. I find I have been thinking of you a great deal. I hope this letter finds you well. Yours sincerely, Caleb Hawthorne. Caleb, a name from another world. She had answered an advertisement 4 months ago. She had cut it from a newspaper that had been used to wrap fish at the back kitchen door, and she had carried it in her apron pocket for 2 days before she dared to write. He had asked for a practical woman of good character. He had asked for someone who could read and write and was not afraid of hard work. He had not asked for a beauty. He had not asked for a dowry. He had not asked for anything she did not have. She had written back. He had written again. 8 letters had passed between them, careful and slow, each one a little less guarded than the one before. He had told her about the mountains in the autumn, and the way the aspens in the high meadows turned so yellow they hurt to look at. He had told her about his brothers in passing, in the vague way men sometimes speak of family. She had pictured him as a man living alone with 2 hired hands. She had not asked for clarification. She had not wanted to seem foolish. He had told her in the last letter that the railroad would bring her as far as Stillwater Creek, Wyoming territory. He had told her that he would meet her at the station. He had told her that no promises would be made until they had met face to face, and that if she chose after meeting him to return home, he would pay her fare. It was perhaps the kindest sentence anyone had written to her in 10 years. She packed her small trunk by the light of a single candle, the navy blue traveling dress that she had been quietly altering in stolen hours over the past 4 months. 2 plain shifts, stockings and a winter shawl, the journal, the Bible that had been her mother's, the cameo, the earrings which she would sell in Chicago for travel money, the 8 letters, the $87 sewn into the lining of her petticoat where no one would think to look. At 3 in the morning, she let herself out the basement door. The snow was still falling. The street lamps were yellow and far apart. She walked the 4 miles to the Boston and Albany station, with her trunk in her hand and her hood pulled low, and she did not look back once. Not at the house, not at the city, not at the 10 years she was leaving behind. The cold went through her cloak and her dress and into the bones of her arms, and still she walked and she did not weep. The 5:47 train pulled out of Boston at sunrise. By the time the Pemberton household discovered she was gone, Eleanor was in Albany. By the time her aunt thought to check the basement room, she was in Buffalo. By the time anyone cared enough to send a wire, she was already crossing into Ohio, and the great long body of the country was opening before her like a book she had never been allowed to read. 6 days she rode. 6 days on hard wooden benches in third-class cars that smelled of coal smoke and tobacco and damp wool. She ate bread and dried apples and drank water from station pumps. She slept sitting upright with her trunk under her feet and her arms wrapped around it. She read her father's journal in the long blue afternoons, and she read Caleb's letters at night when the lamps in the cars were turned low. She watched the country change outside the window. Pennsylvania was green and folded, full of small farms and white churches. Ohio was flatter, broader, the towns farther apart. By Indiana, the snow was thinner and the wind colder, and by Illinois, the prairie had begun that great and terrible openness that her father had once described in a journal she had read as a child. Iowa, Nebraska, the buffalo grass turning silver in the wind. She had never imagined a sky so large. She had not known a country could be so wide. In Boston, the world had seemed small enough to be unkind. Out here, watching the prairie roll past the window for hours and hours and hours, she began to wonder if perhaps the world had simply been a bigger place all along, and no one had ever told her. She crossed into Wyoming territory on the morning of the 6th day. The mountains came up out of the western horizon like a rumor, first a smudge of blue against the sky. Then slowly, hour by hour, they grew. By afternoon, they were unmistakable, a long, jagged wall of indigo and white, and Eleanor pressed her face to the cold window of the train car and stared until her breath fogged the glass and the conductor came past and asked her kindly if she was well. She nodded. She did not trust her voice. She had never seen anything that large in her life. The train pulled into Stillwater Creek Station at 2:20 on the afternoon of the 4th of January, 1876. The station was a wooden platform and a single small building. A pair of iron rails ran out into the snow on either side and disappeared into the white. There was no town visible from the platform. There was a road that ran north toward what looked like a few roof lines half a mile away, and there were the mountains very close now, rising up behind the road like a wall of stone. Eleanor stepped down from the train with her trunk in her hand. The cold hit her like a slap. It was a different cold than Boston cold. Boston cold was wet and gray and full of city smells. This cold was dry and clean and so sharp it made her eyes water. The air smelled of pine and snow and something else she could not name, something that was simply the smell of a place where almost no one lived. Her breath came out in a great white plume. She stood on the platform and looked around. There was no one to meet her. The train pulled away behind her, gathering speed, and she watched it go with a small clenching of her chest. Then she turned and walked toward the small wooden building that served as the station house, and she pushed open the door and went inside. A bell jingled above the door. The room was warm. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, and an old hound dog lay beside it on a folded blanket. The dog raised its head when she came in, looked at her with patient blue eyes, and lowered its head again. Behind a counter, an old man with a chin full of gray whiskers looked up from a newspaper and rose slowly to his feet. He took in the trunk. He took in the navy blue dress that was thin for this weather. He took in the careful, exhausted set of her shoulders. He smiled gently. "Welcome to Stillwater Creek," he said. "You will be Miss Whitfield, I expect." She nodded. I am Mr. Ainsworth, station master, postmaster, and most days the man who sweeps the floor." He gestured to a chair near the stove. "Come on in out of that wind. Caleb Hawthorne wired ahead 2 days ago to say he was riding down to fetch you. The pass north has been heavy with snow. He may be late. The dog there is his. Old Banjo. I keep him while Caleb is in the high country. Banjo, lift your head, you have manners." The hound thumped its tail twice on the blanket and looked at Eleanor with mild interest. She set her trunk down beside the chair and sat. The warmth of the stove went into her bones like a drug. She had not realized how cold she was until she was no longer cold. Mr. Ainsworth poured her a tin cup of coffee from a battered pot and handed it to her without asking, and she took it and held it in both hands and almost wept at the heat of it. "Brothers," she said after a long while. The word came out smaller than she had meant it to. He said his brothers would come. Mr. Ainsworth glanced at her over the top of his newspaper. "Yes, ma'am. The Hawthorne brothers. 3 of them. They live up at the ridge half a day north on a good road and longer when the snow is deep. Good men all 3. Quiet." He paused, watching her face. "You did not know there were 3. "I knew there were brothers." Eleanor's voice was careful. "I did not know how many. I thought perhaps hired hands." Mr. Ainsworth nodded slowly, set down his paper, did not laugh, which Eleanor noticed and was grateful for. "There are 3, he said. Caleb is the oldest, then Wendell, then Jasper. They came up from Texas about 18 months ago and bought the old Hadley place and have been running cattle there ever since. You will be safe with them, Miss Whitfield. Whatever else you might wonder, do not wonder about that." She did not know what to say to that. She drank her coffee. She watched the stove. She listened to the wind move past the building and pull at the eaves. And she thought distantly that perhaps she had made a terrible mistake. She had imagined a man. She had pictured a small house, a garden, a quiet life. She had not pictured 3 men. 3 was a different proposition than 1. 3 was a household, not a marriage. 2 hours passed. The afternoon light through the small window turned from white to gold to orange. Mr. Ainsworth fed the stove and refilled her coffee and did not press her with questions. Old Banjo got up, stretched, walked over to her, and laid his head on her knee. She stroked his ears without thinking, the way she had once long ago stroked the ears of a kitchen cat in a house that no longer existed. Then Mr. Ainsworth lifted his head. "They are coming," he said. He stood up, pulled on his coat. "Do not be alarmed when you see them, Miss Whitfield. Big men, the Hawthorns, all 3, but they are good men." Eleanor stood up too. She smoothed her dress with hands that had begun for the first time all day to shake. She walked to the door. Old Banjo followed her, suddenly alert, his tail beginning to wag. Mr. Ainsworth opened the door, and Eleanor stepped out onto the platform and into the cold orange light of the late afternoon. 3 riders were coming down the road from the north. They were riding hard. Snow flew up in plumes from the hooves of the horses, and the riders sat their saddles like men who had been born to them, cloaked in dark coats that made them look enormous against the white of the road. They were big, all 3 of them. She could see that even at a distance. They were bigger than any men she had ever seen. They drew rein in front of the platform. Steam rose from the horses in great clouds. The lead rider sat for a moment looking at her, and then he swung down from his saddle in one smooth motion, and old Banjo broke loose from beside her and bolted across the platform and threw himself at the man's legs with the unmistakable joy of a dog reunited with his master. The man bent and put a gloved hand on the dog's head. He did not look at the dog. He looked at her. She had thought in some private corner of her mind that she had imagined what Caleb Hawthorne might look like. She had imagined wrong. He was very tall, taller than any man she had ever stood beside. His head was bare now, his hat in his gloved hand, and his hair was the color of dark honey, longer than was fashionable, falling in disordered waves to his collar. His face was sun-browned and weather-worn. There was a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, fine and pale as a thread. His eyes were the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, deep amber, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not read. Not appraisal, not suspicion. Something closer to disbelief, as if he had not quite let himself trust that she would actually come. And now that she had come, he did not know what to do with the fact of her. He took a step forward and stopped. "You are Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was deep and slow. She had not been prepared for the sound of it. "I am," she said. "I am Eleanor Whitfield." "Caleb," he said. "Caleb is fine." He stood there a moment longer looking at her, and then he seemed to remember himself, and turned and gestured toward the two men still mounted behind him. "My brothers," he said. "Wendell, Jasper." She looked past him, and her stomach gave a small, slow turn. Wendell Hawthorne sat his horse like a man who had spent half his life on one. He was a shade shorter than Caleb, but no less broad. His hair was darker, almost black in the late light, and there was a long, pale scar that ran upward through his right eyebrow and into his hairline. His eyes were a colder color than Caleb's, a paler amber, and they did not warm when they found her face. He touched the brim of his hat with one gloved finger and inclined his head, and that was the entirety of his greeting. Jasper was the youngest. She could see it in the set of his face. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with hair the color of oak leaves in autumn sun streaked and curling at his collar. His eyes were brighter than his brother's, the same amber, but softer, and when he met her gaze, he smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the first true smile she had been given by any human being in longer than she could remember. "Welcome to Wyoming, Miss Whitfield," he said. "We are very pleased you have come." Eleanor felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She had expected coldness. She had expected to have to defend herself. She had not expected of all things kindness. She nodded, and she could not quite speak. Caleb looked at her, and something in his face softened almost imperceptibly. "Let me take your trunk," he said. "We have a long ride ahead of us." He carried her trunk to the buckboard wagon that the brothers had brought down with them. He had thought of her comfort. There was a buffalo robe folded on the seat. There was a hot brick wrapped in flannel that he had stopped along the way to warm at someone's hearth. He helped her up onto the bench beside him without ever quite touching her hand longer than was necessary. Wendell and Jasper mounted up. Old Banjo trotted alongside the wagon looking pleased with himself. Caleb clucked to the team, and the wagon pulled out of Stillwater Creek and turned north up the road that ran into the mountains. The road climbed for the first hour through stands of pines so thick that the snow on the ground beneath them was patchy and thin. Then it broke out into a long white meadow and ran along the side of a frozen creek for another hour, and then it climbed again, switching back and forth up the shoulder of a long ridge. The sun went down behind the peaks while they rode. The sky turned green, then violet, then a deep blue. Stars began to come out. She had never seen stars like this. In Boston, the stars had been faint, a few pale points scattered through the haze of street lamps and chimney smoke. Here, as the last light drained out of the sky, they came on by the thousands, by the millions. The sky was a great black bowl pierced everywhere with cold white fire, and Eleanor stared up at it and thought that she had been living all her life with her face in a corner. Caleb spoke to her softly as they rode. He asked her about the journey. He asked her if the trains had been crowded. He asked her if she was warm enough, and when she said yes, he tucked the buffalo robe more securely around her knees anyway. Jasper rode alongside and told her stories about the country, about a coyote that had been stealing eggs from the henhouse all winter, about an elk that had walked through the yard at first light on Christmas morning and stood there as if it owned the place. He had a way of telling stories that made her laugh very softly behind one gloved hand. Wendell did not speak. He rode on the other side of the wagon, his rifle scabbard within easy reach, his eyes moving constantly over the dark line of the trees. He did not look at her. He did not look at his brothers. He watched the country, and his face, when she stole glances at it, was the face of a man who was waiting for something bad to happen. At one point, as the wagon rounded a long curve in the road, Eleanor saw a small orange light burning on a distant ridge to the east. "What is that?" she said. Caleb's answer came a beat too quickly. "A friend," he said. "He sometimes builds a fire up there at night. Nothing to be concerned about." But she saw in the corner of her eye the look that passed between Wendell and Jasper. Just a glance. Half a second. She did not understand it, but she filed it away. There was something they were not telling her. The Hawthorne house came into view a little after 7 o'clock. The wagon climbed one final rise, and then the road dropped down into a long open valley, and Eleanor caught her breath. The valley was bowl-shaped, ringed on 3 sides by mountains. A small river ran down the center half, frozen a ribbon of black water and white ice glinting under the stars. On the eastern slope of the valley, a long wooden house stood with yellow lamplight in its windows. Beyond the house she could make out the dark shapes of a barn, a corral, a smokehouse, and a smaller cabin set apart from the rest. The house was bigger than she had expected, much bigger. It was 2 stories of well-joined timber with a steep roof to shed the snow, and a great stone chimney rising from the center, and smoke from that chimney went straight up into the windless sky like a column. It looked like a place where people lived. She had not realized until that moment how badly she had wanted to come home to a place that looked like that. The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and an older man stepped out onto the porch with a lantern in his hand. He was perhaps 65 years old, gray-haired and gray-bearded, with a face that had been weathered by every wind that had ever blown across Texas. He limped slightly as he came down the steps. The lantern light fell across his eyes, which were a startling pale blue, and he removed his hat in her direction with an old-fashioned courtesy that nearly undid her. "Welcome to the Ridge, ma'am," he said. "I am Mose Hartwell. I have been riding the country for the Hawthorns a while now. I have your room ready." He had called her ma'am. In 10 years, no one had called her ma'am. She climbed down from the wagon, and Caleb steadied her elbow briefly and let go. Mose carried her trunk inside. Wendell saw to the horses without speaking. Jasper held the door for her. Old Banjo went in ahead of them as if he had been doing so all his life. The inside of the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and something like roasted meat. The floors were of broad pine boards, sanded smooth and rubbed with linseed oil. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and a fire was burning in it. There was a long dining table that could have seated 8. There were 3 deep leather chairs near the hearth. A staircase climbed to a second floor. A doorway opened into what looked like a small library, and even at a glance, Eleanor could see that the shelves were full. Shakespeare, Emerson, Walter Scott, a row of green volumes that looked like veterinary manuals, books on agriculture, books on engineering. She had not expected books. She had not, she realized, expected any of this. Caleb hung his coat on a peg by the door and turned to her. "Your room is upstairs," he said. "Mose has the fire laid. The minister rides this circuit once every 2 months. He will be here in 12 days. Until then, you have your own room and a key for the door." He paused. "If you change your mind about any of this, Miss Whitfield, I will pay your fare home. No questions asked. No hard feelings. The choice is yours." She stared at him. She had been told all her life what her choices were. She had been told there were no choices. She had been told that she would do as she was instructed, that she would marry whom she was told, that she would be grateful for whatever scraps fell to her from her aunt's table. This stranger, who had ridden 2 days through deep snow to fetch her from a railway station, was telling her that she had the right to leave. She did not know what to say, so she said the only thing she could think of: "Thank you." He nodded once. Then he gestured toward the staircase, and Mose appeared at the top of the stairs with her trunk and her lantern, and Eleanor climbed the stairs and went into the room that had been prepared for her. It was a small room, whitewashed walls, a narrow bed with a quilt that had been hand-stitched by someone who knew what they were doing, a washstand with a pitcher and a basin, a small desk by the window, curtains. The fire in the small stove had been lit. The room smelled of clean linen and pine. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 6 days, she allowed herself to cry. She cried very quietly. She cried for 10 minutes, and then she washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher and combed her hair and went down to supper. The supper was venison stew and fresh bread and butter and black coffee. The 5 of them sat around the long table, Mose at the foot, Caleb at the head, Eleanor at his right hand, Wendell across from her, Jasper at her left. Old Banjo sat under the table at her feet in the way that hounds will adopt anyone they sense is a soft touch. The conversation was careful. Caleb asked her about Boston in general terms, and she answered in general terms. Jasper made her laugh once, telling a story about a goat that had taken an unreasonable disliking to him last summer. Mose talked about the weather, about the snow on the high passes, about the way the wolves had been bolder this winter than last. Wendell said almost nothing. He ate methodically, his eyes on his plate, his shoulders set in a way that she recognized that she had spent 10 years learning to recognize the way some people set themselves against the presence of an unwelcome guest. Then halfway through the meal he set down his fork. "You should not have come," he said. The room went silent. Eleanor's hand stopped halfway to her cup. Wendell said, "Caleb." His voice was low, a warning. Wendell did not look at his brother. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of cold metal. "This is no place for you," he said. "Boston is your country. You should go back there. There is still time." Behind her, Mose was very still. Jasper had set down his bread. Eleanor put her cup down carefully on the table. She drew a long breath. She felt somewhere underneath her ribs the same bending and breaking she had felt that afternoon behind the lacquered screen in the Pemberton parlor. Only this time she did not bend. This time something in her stood up. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. Her voice was quieter than it should have been, but it was steady. "I have lived for 10 years in a basement kitchen in Boston, rising at 4 o'clock in the morning to lay fires for women who never once looked me in the eye. I have ridden a train alone for 6 days across half the continent with $87 in my pocket. I do not believe that the weather is what I should be most afraid of in this country. But if you have another reason that I should leave, I would thank you to say it plainly." Wendell stared at her. The silence stretched. The fire in the great stone hearth popped softly. Old Banjo sighed under the table. Wendell looked at her for what seemed like a long time. Then he looked away at the fire and his jaw worked once as if he had bitten down on a word and swallowed it. "The winter is enough," he said at last. But she heard it. She heard the lie in his voice the way she had heard her aunt's lies for 10 years. He was not afraid of the winter. He was afraid of something else, and he was not going to tell her what it was. Across the table, Caleb's eyes had not left her face. There was something in them that had not been there before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition, as if he had just seen her fully for the first time. Mose drew on his pipe. The smoke went up in a slow blue spiral. "Boston girl," he said softly, almost to himself. "I have seen a lot of women come to this country. Most of them do not last the first winter. But the ones that do, ma'am, the ones that do, they become the spine of this place. I think you have got that spine. I think you do not know it yet, but I think you do." Eleanor did not answer. She picked up her cup. Her hand had stopped shaking. She drank her coffee and she finished her stew, and she did not look at Wendell again. Later, when the dishes had been cleared and the fire had been banked, and the brothers had gone out to check the stock for the night, she stood at the small window of her upstairs room and looked out across the moonlit valley. The mountains rose around her like the walls of an enormous, quiet room. The sky was full of stars she did not have names for. Somewhere far away on a high ridge, an orange light flickered and went out. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She did not know what these brothers were hiding. She did not know what shadow lay on this beautiful valley. She did not know what the next 12 days would bring, or the next 12 weeks, or the next 12 years. But she knew with a strange new certainty that had been born in her at supper that for the first time in her life she had spoken back. And no one had struck her for it, and no one had laughed. In the morning she would begin to find out what she had walked into. Outside in the dark beyond the window, old Banjo lifted his head from the porch boards and looked north where the orange fire on the ridge had been, and he gave one low, quiet whine into the cold air, as if he too were waiting for something to come. The first 3 days at Hawthorne Ridge passed for Eleanor in the careful, watchful manner of a woman learning the bones of an unfamiliar house. She rose at 5 the way she had always risen. Old habits did not loosen in a single night. She lit the kitchen stove. She set the coffee on. She kneaded bread on the long pine board that Mose Hartwell had set up near the window, and by the time the men came in from the morning chores, breakfast was on the table. No one had asked her to do this. That was the strangest part. In Boston, every task had been an obligation. Here, she did the work because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and because it gave her a small private comfort to feel useful in a house that for now was not yet hers. Caleb watched her the way a man watches weather. He did not interfere. He did not praise. He thanked her simply when she set his coffee in front of him, and he ate what she put on his plate, and she noticed that he ate slowly with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned at some point in his life not to take meals for granted. Wendell still did not speak to her. He came in for breakfast, ate without lifting his eyes much past the rim of his cup, and went out again. He had not said a word to her since the night she had answered him at supper, and Eleanor did not know whether his silence was anger or something else. She did not ask. Jasper made it bearable. He came down each morning with his hair still wet from washing and half a story already on his tongue, and he told it to her while she set the table. He told her about the dog. He told her about the time 3 winters back when Caleb had fallen through the ice on the upper creek and walked home soaked and freezing, and refused to admit all the way that anything was wrong. Jasper laughed when he told it. Caleb, sitting at the head of the table, lifted his coffee and said only without rancor that some things did not need to be retold every winter, but Jasper retold them anyway. On the second morning, Caleb walked her down to the barn after breakfast. He did not say much on the way. He carried a coil of rope on his shoulder and his rifle in one hand, and old Banjo trotted ahead of them through the snow with his nose to the ground. The barn was big and well kept, and inside it Eleanor met the horses for the first time. There were 4 of them, all good stock, well-groomed, with the heavy winter coats of animals that lived hard but were cared for. One of them, a black gelding, nearly 17 hands tall, lifted his head when Caleb walked in and made a low sound in his chest that was somewhere between a greeting and a question. "This is Midnight Cavalier," Caleb said. "He has been with me a long time." She came closer. The black horse had a long, pale scar along the line of his cheekbone, the hair grown back in white, a line as fine as a feather. Eleanor reached up slowly and laid her gloved hand on his neck. The horse breathed out hot against her wrist. "What happened to him?" she said. Caleb did not answer for a long moment. He set the rope down on a hook on the wall. He took off his right glove and laid his bare hand on the horse's nose, and the horse pushed gently into his palm. "Texas," he said. "There was a fight one night. He took the cut across the cheek that I would have taken across the throat. He saved my life." Eleanor looked at him. He did not look at her. He was looking at the horse. "There was a fight," she said. She kept her voice careful. "With whom?" A long pause. "With men who needed fighting," Caleb said. He did not say more. He turned and walked the length of the barn, checking the stalls, and Eleanor stood with her hand on the warm neck of a horse that had taken a blade meant for the throat of the man she had agreed to marry. And she filed the moment away with all the other small filed moments, and she did not press him. Not yet. But she was beginning to understand that there was a Texas behind these men the way there was a Boston behind her. A country they had left. A reason they had left it. That afternoon, while Caleb and Jasper rode down to the south fence to see to a break in the wire, Wendell took his rifle and his snowshoes and went up the long slope behind the house to set traps. Mose was repairing a door on the smokehouse. Eleanor found that she had, for the first time since arriving, a stretch of the day to herself. She put on her cloak. She wrapped her shawl around her head and shoulders. She went out into the yard. She was not snooping. She told herself this as she walked. She was simply learning the place. A woman who was going to live here perhaps for the rest of her life had every right to walk her own ground. She walked past the chicken coop, past the smokehouse where Mose lifted his hand to her in greeting without looking up from his work, past the corral where the 4th horse, a red mare, lifted her head and watched her pass with mild interest. She walked along the west side of the barn where the snow was knee-deep in places and unbroken by tracks. She walked because she was restless. She walked because after 6 days on a train and 4 nights in someone else's house, the body needs to walk. It was at the back of the barn that she found the cellar door. She had not noticed it before. It was set into the slope of the hill behind the structure, half hidden by a drift of snow that had blown up against the boards. A door of weathered planks, latched but not locked, set flush with the ground at an angle. A root cellar. Every farm had one. There would be potatoes inside, onions, salt pork, preserves. The ordinary stores of an ordinary household. She told herself she was only curious about the household stores. She lifted the latch. The door swung up with a small, dry creak. Cold air sighed up out of the dark. She found a candle and a tin of matches on a small shelf just inside the doorway, where a sensible household would keep them, and she struck a match and lit the candle and went down the stone steps into the dark. The cellar was as she had imagined: sacks of potatoes, strings of onions hanging from rafters, a barrel of salt pork, crocks of pickled cabbage and pickled beets sealed with wax, smoked ham wrapped in muslin, the familiar, comforting smell of a country pantry in winter. But at the back of the cellar, against the far stone wall, half covered by a piece of old oilcloth, there was a wooden chest. It was the wrong thing to find in a root cellar. A root cellar had food in it. A root cellar did not have a chest with brass corners and a tarnished lock. A chest like that belonged in an attic, not in the cold ground beneath a barn. Eleanor stood looking at it for a long moment in the candle light, and she felt in the back of her neck the same prickling she had felt as a child when she had been about to do something she would be punished for. She told herself she should turn around. She told herself she should go back upstairs. She did neither. She crossed the cellar and lifted the oilcloth. She knelt in front of the chest. She tried the lock. It was not locked. The hasp had simply been thrown closed, the way a man might close a chest he did not expect anyone to find. Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside the chest was carefully packed. On the top lay a folded United States flag, the small kind a soldier might carry. Beneath it, 2 small leather cases, the kind that held service medals. Beneath those, a Bible. A heavy old Bible bound in dark leather, its corners cracked with age. She lifted the Bible out and opened it on her knee. The flyleaf had a family tree written on it in 2 different hands. The older hand faded and brown listed Jacob Bramwell, born 1812 in Tennessee. Hannah Hawthorne. Bramwell, born 1818 in Virginia. Their wedding date in 1838. Then the children. Caleb Bramwell, born 1840. Wendell Bramwell, born 1843. Jasper Bramwell, born 1848. And one more name in a younger hand, the strokes uneven, the letters, careful as if someone very young had been allowed to write it themselves. Hester Bramwell, born 1856. Eleanor stared at it. Bramwell, not Hawthorne. She sat back on her heels. The candle flickered in her shaking hand. The name moved in her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. She turned the page. There were dates of death written in the older hand in ink that was darker than the rest. Jacob Bramwell died April 1870. Hannah Bramwell died April 1870. Hester Bramwell died April 1870. 3 deaths, all in the same month. A family struck down together. She closed the Bible. Her hands were not steady. She lifted the smaller leather cases out of the chest and opened them. She had seen medals like these before in the homes of widowed neighbors in Boston. They were Confederate cavalry medals. One bore the name C. Bramwell. The other bore the name W. Bramwell. Underneath them, neatly folded, was a yellowed newspaper clipping. She did not want to read it. She read it anyway. Bramwell brothers wanted for the murder of 6 men in Comanche County. Reward $500 each. She sat very still. Underneath the clipping was a small photograph, a pharaoh-type set in a cardboard frame. A family of 5 posed on a porch. A tall, thin man in his middle years with a grave face, a woman with a soft mouth, her hands folded in her lap. 3 boys, perhaps 15 and 12 and 7, lined up in order of height. and in front of them all, leaning against her mother's knee, a little girl of perhaps 10, with her hair in 2 long braids, her eyes bright, her chin lifted, her mouth caught in the beginning of a laugh. Hester, the girl who had been 14 when she died. Eleanor placed her hand on the picture very gently, as if she were afraid of disturbing the dead. She did not hear the cellar door open. She did not hear the boots on the stone steps. She heard only a voice behind her, low and tired, that said, "So now you know." She turned. Wendell Hawthorne stood at the foot of the steps with his rifle in his hand. He did not have it pointed at her. He held it the way a man holds a tool he has not yet decided whether to use. The candlelight made his face look older than his 33 years. The scar through his right eyebrow was a line of white in the dim light. His eyes were not cold now. They were tired, and they were sad, and they were watching her without any apology at all. Eleanor did not move. "Are you going to kill me?" she said. She had not meant to say it. The words came out of her of their own accord. Her voice was steadier than she would have expected. Wendell looked at her. "No, ma'am," he said. "I am not going to kill you. I have never killed an innocent person in my life, and I am not going to start tonight." He set the rifle down. He leaned it carefully against the stone wall, the muzzle pointing up. He came down the last 2 steps. He sat down across from her on an upturned crate, and the candle was between them, and he laid his gloved hands on his knees and looked at her across the small bright flame. "But you have a right to know what you have walked into," he said, "and you have a right to choose what you do about it." She listened. He told her then, in the cold of the cellar, with the oilcloth pushed back and the chest open between them, the story she had not been told. He told her about Comanche County, Texas, the Bramwell Ranch, 1,500 acres of fair grazing, and one of the best year-round springs in that whole dry stretch of country. He told her about Asa Crane, the cattle baron, whose land bordered theirs, who had needed water, and who had decided that the Bramwell Spring was going to be his. He told her about the offer, and the second offer, and the third offer, each one lower than the last. He told her about the Bramwell cattle that had begun to be found dead in odd places, the fences cut, the line shack burned. He told her about the day in April of 1870 when he and Caleb had ridden down to Fort Worth to buy breeding stock, and how they had taken 3 days about it because they had not believed that things were yet so bad. He told her what they had found when they came home. He told her in plain words without dressing the truth up, and Eleanor sat across from him and did not weep because she had a sense that he did not need her tears to know what his own story sounded like. He told her about the burned house. He told her about his father in the yard, 2 bullets in his chest, dead since dawn. He told her about his mother in the bedroom. He told her about Hester, 14 years old, found in her mother's arms, and the old, long Sharps rifle still in her small hands. He told her there had been 3 men of Asa Crane's lying dead in the yard, and that they all had been shot from the front, and that one of them had taken a wound in the thigh that had bled out slow and bad, and that this last one Wendell believed had been the work of the small girl with the long braids in the photograph. He had not known until that day what his sister was made of. He told her about the 5 years that followed. He told her that the law in Comanche County had been Asa Crane's law, that the sheriff had been Asa Crane's man, that the judges had drunk Asa Crane's whiskey and ridden Asa Crane's horses. He told her that they had gone to the law first, the 3 of them, and that the law had laughed. So they had made a list. 6 names. Asa Crane and the 5 men who had ridden with him to the Bramwell place in April of 1870. He told her how it had taken 5 years. He told her that every man on the list had been faced. Every one. None had been shot from behind. Every one had been given a chance to lay down his arms and account for what he had done. 2 had laid them down. 2 had wept and confessed and asked for the chance to make some restitution, and Caleb had told them to leave Texas and never come back, and they had gone. 4 had not laid them down. They had drawn, and they had fired, and they had died in fair fights with witnesses, the kind of fights that the West called justice, and the law called murder. The last of them had been Asa Crane himself. October of 1875, in the main street of Amarillo in front of 12 witnesses in a fair draw. Crane had been 65 years old and slow on the trigger, and Caleb had been 35 and not slow, and the matter had ended on a piece of dirt in front of a saloon called the Crystal Springs. After that, the law had finally stirred. Not for the first 6 men who had been Asa Crane's killers, for Asa Crane, who had been a rich and respectable cattleman whose name was on land deeds and bank accounts and county records. The federal warrant had come down in December of 1875. The Bramwell brothers had loaded a wagon. They had ridden north. They had not stopped riding until they were in Wyoming territory, and they had bought the old Hadley place under their mother's maiden name, which was Hawthorne, and which was as legal as their own birth names. They had set themselves to ranch work. They had told no one. For 18 months, they had been waiting in this valley for the past to come, walking up the road from Stillwater Creek. Wendell finished speaking. The candle had burned down by half. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The cellar was very still. Somewhere above them faintly she could hear old Banjo barking at something out in the yard. Moses' voice far off calling the dog back to the porch. "There is a man," she said at last. Her voice was low. "There is a man hunting you." "Yes, ma'am." "Who?" Wendell looked at her. The candlelight caught in his eyes. "He is United States Marshal Bram Crane," he said. "He is Asa Crane's son. He has been on our trail for 6 years. The first 5 we did not give him much to find. The last 18 months we have been quiet, and he has been quiet, and we have hoped in the way fools hope that he had given up. He has not. He is somewhere on the western plains right now, asking after 3 brothers in a mountain valley. He will come." Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Aunt Margaret. She thought of Edwin Thatcher's cold hands. She thought of the laughter in the parlor on the afternoon she had decided to leave Boston. She had run from one set of cold men into the company of a different set entirely. She opened her eyes. "Why did you let your brother send for a wife?" she said quietly. "Knowing this, knowing what is coming." Wendell's mouth tightened. He looked at the candle. "I told him not to," he said. "I told him bringing a woman into this was the worst thing he could do, to her or to us." He listened, and then he placed the advertisement anyway. "Why?" Wendell did not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was different, lower, as if he were speaking past her to someone who was not there. "Because Caleb is the best man I know," he said. "Because he has carried our family on his back since he was 22 years old. Because he held our mother when she died, and our sister when she died, and our father when he died, and he did not weep then, and he has not wept since, and a man cannot live like that forever. Because for 4 months he sat at that desk in the library and read your letters by the lamp at night, and he read them slow, and he read them again. And one evening in November, I found him asleep at the table with one of your letters in his hand, and his face, while he was asleep, was the face of a man who had remembered how to hope. I have not seen him hope in 6 years. I told him he had no right to it. I told him you were not a thing he could ask of God. He said he knew. He said it anyway. Wendell stopped. He looked at her. I did not want to like you, he said. I am sorry. I am still going to ask you to leave. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were folded in her lap. The pearl earrings of her grandmother, sold for $87, had brought her to this candle in this cellar. The botanical journal of her father, with its careful sketches of milkweed and morning glory, had ridden across half a continent in her trunk. She had nothing left of either of her parents but the things she had brought and the choice she was about to make. She thought of Edwin Thatcher. She thought of the basement on Beacon Street. She thought of a man who had read her letters slowly by lamplight and had remembered how to hope. I will think on it, she said. Wendell nodded. He stood. He picked up his rifle. He paused at the foot of the steps. Whatever you decide, he said, do not tell my brothers what you have seen tonight. That is not my secret to give. It is theirs. You decide first what you will do, and then we will tell them together. If you stay, we tell them. If you go, we tell them. Either way, they hear it from me, not from you. Do we have an understanding? Yes, she said. Above them, the cellar door was suddenly thrown open. Light came down the steps. Caleb's voice, sharp with sudden alarm, called down into the dark. Wendell. Eleanor. Are you down there? Wendell did not look away from her. His eyes held hers a moment longer. She knows he set up the stairs. She found the chest. Silence. Then very quietly, Caleb's voice. Come up, all of you. Come up to the kitchen. We will talk. Eleanor closed the chest. She blew out the candle. She climbed the cellar steps with her hand on the cold stone wall to steady herself. Caleb stood at the top lantern in his hand, his face in shadow. He did not speak. He stepped aside to let her pass. She walked across the yard with her cloak pulled tight. An old banjo padded silent at her heels, and the wind off the mountains moved through the pines with a long, low sound that was almost like breathing. Inside, the kitchen lamp had been turned up. Jasper sat at the table, his face white. He had not been told yet. He could see in his brothers' faces that something had broken. Mose stood by the stove with his arms folded. The fire had been built up high. Caleb pulled out a chair for her. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table and he said, looking at her and not at his brothers, Eleanor, I owe you the truth. I owed it to you in Boston. I owed it to you on the platform at the station. I should have written it in my last letter. I did not. I told myself I would tell you when you arrived. Then you arrived, and I told myself I would tell you tomorrow. Then tomorrow came, and I told myself another tomorrow. Wendell has done what I should have done. I am sorry for that. He drew a long breath. My name is Caleb Bramwell, he said. My brothers are Wendell Bramwell and Jasper Bramwell. Hawthorne is our mother's name. We took it because it is legally ours, and because we needed a name that the federal warrants did not bear. Everything else my brother has told you tonight is true. We are the men in that newspaper. We did the things it says we did. We did not do them in cold blood, but we did them. He paused. His amber eyes did not leave her face. I will not ask you to stay. I do not have the right. If you wish to leave, I will take you down to Stillwater Creek tomorrow morning. I will pay your fare to anywhere on the railroad you would like to go, and I will not trouble your name again. I would only ask that you keep our secret as long as you live. That is all I will ask of you. Eleanor sat at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought of the journal upstairs in her trunk, and her father's careful handwriting on a margin she had read by lamplight on the train. Truth grows where it can find sunlight. Be patient with the dark places. The dark places are the soil. She lifted her head. I have 3 conditions, she said. The kitchen went very still. Caleb blinked. Mose set down the iron poker he had been holding. Jasper looked for a moment as if he might laugh and then thought better of it. Caleb said, 3 conditions. Yes, she said. If I am to stay, I have 3 conditions. The first is that you will never lie to me again. Not by silence, not by half a truth. If a federal marshal is riding through the country, I will know. If a man is threatening this place, I will know. I am 22 years old, and I have been a child long enough. I will not be a child here. Caleb opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded. The second condition, she said, is that the wedding will go forward when the minister comes, but not as an arrangement. I want to know whether you wish to marry me as a man marries a woman, or as a man takes on a piece of cover to make himself look ordinary. I will accept either answer, but I want the answer. Caleb did not answer at once. He came around the table. He did not sit. He stood beside her chair and looked down at her, and his face in the lamplight was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was setting it down in front of her. For 4 months, he said, every time one of your letters came, I read it 3 times before I went to bed. I am not a man given to romance, Miss Whitfield. I am a hard man. I have done hard things. But you wrote to me about your father. You wrote to me about the way the lily of the valley smelled in your mother's garden. You wrote to me with the same care that you would use carrying water across a swept floor, and I wanted very much to know the woman who could write like that. When I saw you on the platform in Stillwater Creek, I was afraid you would be disappointed in me. I was not afraid of the other way around. I would marry you as a man marries a woman, Eleanor Whitfield, if you will have me. That is my answer. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor breathed in once, slowly. She breathed out. The third condition, she said. If Marshal Crane comes, we do not run. Whatever else this household does, it does not run. There is a way out of this that does not require anyone else to die. I do not know yet what it is, but I know it exists. I have a head for puzzles. My father taught me. I would like the chance to use it. Wendell, leaning against the wall by the door, lifted his head. For the first time since she had met him, his mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile but was close. All right, he said quietly. Caleb said, all 3. Mose by the stove said nothing, but his old blue eyes were wet, and he turned away to feed another stick to the fire that did not need feeding. The minister came 8 days later. His name was Reverend Pemberton Quincy. He was 65 years old with white whiskers and a bent back from a long-ago Union Army wound. He had been a chaplain at Antietam. He did not know that he was about to bless the marriage of a Confederate cavalryman, and Caleb did not see any need to tell him. The Reverend stood in the parlor of the Hawthorne house in his black coat and his white collar, and he read the words of the service in his clear old voice, and he asked Eleanor if she would have this man, and Eleanor said she would. She wore the navy blue traveling dress. She had no other. She wore her mother's silver cameo at her throat. Her hair had been brushed until it shone and pinned up in a simple knot, and tendrils of it had escaped already around her temples. She looked, she thought, when she had glanced in the small mirror in her room that morning, almost like someone who belonged to herself. Caleb wore a black coat and a white shirt that he had had made for the occasion in Cheyenne the previous fall on a hunch he had been ashamed to name. He stood beside her, and his hand, when he took hers, was warm and steady. The ring he placed on her finger had belonged to his mother. He had told her this beforehand in the kitchen, with his eyes on the fire, so that she would not have to react in front of his brothers. He had said my mother would have wanted it on a hand worth wearing it. She had not been able to answer. When he spoke his vows, Caleb added his own line at the end, where the service did not call for one. "I will listen to your counsel," he said. "I will not make a decision in this house without asking yours. I will be your partner under God and under this roof, and not your master. This I promise." Reverend Quincy did not look surprised exactly. He looked instead as if he had heard many vows in his long life, and that he was glad all over again when he heard a good one. Mose stood up as a witness. So did a man Eleanor had met for the first time that week, an old hunter named Augustus Macaulay, who lived alone in a cabin half a day to the north and had ridden down because Caleb had asked him. Gus was Scots-Irish, a man of the high country, in his early 60s, with hair the color of weathered iron and pale blue eyes that had seen too much weather. He had brought Eleanor a wedding gift, a small bunch of dried mountain lavender tied with a strip of doeskin. He had pressed it into her hand without ceremony and gone to stand in the back of the room. When the words were done, Caleb leaned down and kissed her once lightly on the forehead. That was their wedding. That night he did not come to her room. He had told her 2 days before that he would not. He had told her that they had time, that there was no hurry, that she had been tired and afraid for a long time, and that whatever had to be was to be on her own terms and her own clock. He had said it sitting on the edge of his desk in the library, with his eyes on the fire, the way men speak when they are saying something they mean. Eleanor had nodded. She had not trusted herself with words. He had built a fire in her room that night. He had set fresh water in the basin. He had laid a small green book on the bed pillow with no note, no inscription. A second-hand copy of her father's first published paper on the wildflowers of New England, which he had ordered somehow from a bookseller in Philadelphia. She held the book in both hands for a long time. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, and at last, in the privacy of her closed door and her single candle, she did weep. Outside in the yard, old Banjo walked his slow circuit around the house. The fire on the high ridge did not burn that night. The valley was quiet. In the morning, the marriage began. Marriage, she discovered, was nothing like what she had been taught. She had been raised by women who described it as a contract of duty, a roof in exchange for service, a name in exchange for obedience. She had pictured on the long train ride west a household much like her aunt's only, with a different master and herself in a slightly different version of the same apron. Caleb did not give her an apron. He gave her the first morning after the wedding a key, the key to the strong box in the library where the household money was kept. He showed her the ledger. He showed her the columns. He said, "This is the income from the cattle, and this is the standing debt at the bank in Cheyenne, and this is what we owe at the mercantile in Stillwater Creek, and this is what we have set aside in case the spring calving goes badly. He said, you have a better hand for sums than I do. I would be grateful if you would take the books." She took them. Within 3 days, she had found 2 errors, small ones. A misplaced decimal in the feed account, a double entry in the November column. He had thanked her without flinching. He had said, "You see." He had not been embarrassed. He had not been threatened. He had been pleased the way a man is pleased when a partner does what a partner is supposed to do. It was a small thing. It changed everything. She drew up plans for a medicinal herb garden working from her father's journal. Yarrow, echinacea, comfrey, mountain mint. She showed Caleb the sketch on the kitchen table one evening, her finger moving across the lines she had drawn, and Mose came up behind her chair and looked over her shoulder and said low, "That is a thinking woman's garden, ma'am." And Caleb said simply, "When the snow goes, we break the ground wherever you say." Jasper began to bring her books from the small library without being asked. Walter Scott, a book of poems by Tennyson she had never read. He would set them on the kitchen table at her elbow when she was peeling potatoes, and he would say nothing and walk away. Wendell was the slowest to come in. He did not speak to her much, even after the wedding. He watched her. She caught him at it sometimes, his amber eyes on her face across the breakfast table, and when she looked up, he would look away. But she noticed that he had begun on the third morning to bring in the firewood for her stove without being asked. She noticed that he had begun on the fifth morning to tip his hat to her when he came in from the yard. Small things, tiny weather, the slow softening of a hard thing. Then one morning, 15 days after the wedding, Augustus Macaulay rode down from his cabin in the North Hills, and he sat his horse in the yard, and would not dismount, and he would not come inside. Caleb went out to him. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window. She saw Gus speak. She saw Caleb's face change. She saw Caleb turn and look once briefly at the house. Then Caleb came back inside, and he closed the door behind him very carefully, and he stood with his back against the door for a moment before he spoke. "There are men in Stillwater Creek," he said, "asking after 3 brothers who run cattle in a mountain valley. They are not lawmen. Gus knows the look. They are gun hands. 5 of them. They came in 2 days ago, and they have not left. They are drawing pay from a man named Cyrus Whitlock." Wendell behind him set down his coffee cup very slowly. Eleanor had heard the name once before. She remembered. Mose had mentioned a Cyrus Whitlock in passing during her first week when she had asked about the neighbors. He had said a big rancher down south, owns a deal of country, wants to own more. Now sitting at the table with her hands very still around her own cup, she watched the brothers' faces, and she watched Mose's face, and she saw in all of them that this was the second front. The federal marshal was still out there somewhere on the plains. He was still coming. But before the marshal arrived, this country was about to test them in a different way. A cattle baron who needed water. 5 gun hands at the saloon in Stillwater Creek, a long valley with one good year-round spring, and a family that for reasons of its own could not run. Caleb looked at her. "Eleanor," he said, "you said you wanted to be told." "Yes," she said, "I did." "Then I am telling you," he said. "The trouble has come to the door. Now we decide what we do." And outside on the porch, old Banjo lifted his great gray head and looked south down the valley road, and he made deep in his chest a low warning sound, the kind a hound makes when it has caught a scent on the wind that it does not yet trust. The trouble came in pieces, the way trouble often does in country like that. Not all at once, not in a single bright flash that a man could meet head-on with a rifle in a steady hand. It came in small, mean pieces, each one designed to wear them down a little further, each one designed to make the next piece seem reasonable by comparison. The first piece came on a Tuesday, 3 days after Augustus Macaulay had ridden down from the high cabin with the news of the gun hands at the saloon. Caleb and Jasper rode the south fence at first light as they did once a week in winter, and they came back in by noon with their faces set hard. 40 yards of wire had been cut clean through. 30 head of cattle had drifted out into the wide, flat country to the south, and it had taken the brothers and Mose 2 long, cold days to find them all and walk them home. 2 of the cows came back lame. 1 never came back at all. The second piece came on a Friday. Caleb's best riding gelding, a chestnut named Sergeant, who had carried him all the way up from Texas, was found dead in the upper pasture with a bullet in his chest. Wendell, who had not been a sniper for nothing, walked the line of the shot back across the snow and stopped at last at a flat outcrop of rock 1/2 mile north of the boundary. There was a single brass casing in the snow there, a .50 caliber Sharps, the same kind of round Wendell himself had carried during the war. He stood looking at it for a long time before he picked it up. He did not say much when he came back in. He laid the casing on the kitchen table beside Eleanor's coffee cup and went out again without taking off his coat. The third piece came nailed to a fence post on the road that led up to the house. A square of brown paper waited at the bottom with a stone held in place by a single nail driven through the top. The handwriting was careful. The message was short: sell or burn. Whitlock. Caleb pulled the nail with his bare hand. He read the paper. He folded it once. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He did not say a word the whole ride back to the house, and Eleanor, who had ridden out with him in the wagon to deliver the noon meal to the men working the high pasture, sat beside him on the bench and did not speak either, because she had begun to understand that there were silences in this country that did not want talking through. That evening the men gathered at the kitchen table. Caleb laid the paper down where they could all see it. Mose stood by the stove with his arms folded. Augustus Macaulay had been sent for, and he sat at the far end with his hat on his knee and his pale eyes moving from face to face. The lamp in the center of the table threw long shadows up the walls. Old Banjo lay with his head on Eleanor's foot. "I have seen this before," Caleb said quietly. "In Texas. A man wants what is yours, and he cannot buy it, so he begins to teach you slowly that you cannot afford to keep it. He kills your stock. He cuts your fences. He puts notes on your gate posts. And one night he comes with men." He looked up. He looked at Eleanor first, then at his brothers. "I will not let it happen here," he said. Wendell said, "What do you propose, brother?" Caleb said, "I propose we ride into Stillwater Creek tomorrow, and we have a conversation with Mr. Whitlock's man. The one Gus says is named Renfro. I propose we have it in front of as many witnesses as the Silver Spur Saloon can hold. I propose he understand in plain language that this household is not Texas, and these brothers are not what we were 10 years ago, and that he has badly misjudged the value of what he has come to buy." Eleanor said, "I would like to come with you." The kitchen went still. Caleb turned to her. He did not say no immediately. That was, she had begun to understand one of the things she loved about him. He did not say no immediately to anything she said. He turned the question over the way he might turn a horseshoe, looking at every side of it. Why, he said, because she said, "I am a stranger in this country, because no one in Stillwater Creek has yet had a good, clear look at the woman you brought home from the train, because the only story they will have heard about me is whatever Mr. Whitlock has paid them to tell, and because I think it is harder for a man like Whitlock to plan the burning of a house when he has shaken the hand of the woman who lives in it." There was a long silence. Mose drew on his pipe. The blue smoke went up. Augustus Macaulay said in his slow Scots-Irish drawl, "The lass has the right of it." Caleb looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "We ride in the morning," he said. "All of us." They rode at first light, Caleb on midnight cavalier, his rifle in the scabbard and a Colt revolver at his hip, Wendell on the red mare with the long sharps wrapped in oilcloth across his back, Jasper on his bay gelding, Augustus Macaulay on a tough little mountain pony that looked half the size of the others and was by every account the toughest animal in the valley. Mose stayed back at the ranch with the rifle and the dog because someone had to, and because Mose at 65 did not ride into town unless there was no other man to send. Eleanor rode in the wagon beside Caleb when he climbed down off the horse for the last mile to spare the team in the deep snow. The morning was cold and very clear. The mountains stood up against the sky like cut tin. Smoke from the few chimneys of Stillwater Creek rose in thin, straight lines a long way off, visible from miles away in the still air. The Silver Spur Saloon was the largest building on the main street. It had a false front, a long porch, and a pair of tall windows that did not open even in summer. When Caleb pushed open the swinging doors and walked in with Wendell at his right shoulder and Jasper at his left, and Augustus Macaulay a half step behind, the conversation in the room dropped by half. Eleanor came in last, her hand on Caleb's left arm. She felt every eye in the room turn to her. She did not look down. She had spent 10 years looking down. She did not have any look down left in her. Sterling Renfro was at the bar. He was a tall man in his middle 30s, lean and dressed in good black wool, with a low-slung gun belt and a face that had been handsome before something had hardened it. He turned slowly on his stool when the doors banged shut behind them. His eyes went over the brothers. They went over Augustus Macaulay with a flicker of recognition that he covered quickly. Then they came to Eleanor. They lingered. "Mr. Hawthorne," Renfro said. He did not stand. "We were beginning to wonder when you would come down and visit." Caleb did not return the smile. He walked the length of the room until he was 3 paces from the bar, and Wendell drifted to the end of the counter where he could see the door, and Jasper took up a place by the front window. Augustus Macaulay leaned on a post by the entry as if he were merely watching the weather. Eleanor stayed at Caleb's side, and she looked Sterling Renfro full in the face, and she did not blink. "Tell your employer Caleb said that I do not sell." Renfro raised an eyebrow. "I have told him." "He does not seem to hear it." "Then tell him in different words. Tell him he is welcome to send another man with another offer, and I will refuse it. Tell him he is welcome to send another note, and I will burn it. Tell him that the next fence he cuts on my place will cost him more than he expects. And tell him that the next animal of mine he kills will be answered for by me on his own ground." Renfro's eyes narrowed slightly. "That sounds," he said, "like a threat. It sounds," Caleb said, "like a man telling another man where the line is. Take it however you wish." There was a long pause. The men at the tables had stopped pretending not to listen. The bartender was very still, polishing a glass that had been polished already. Renfro's eyes drifted back to Eleanor. "Boston, is it not?" he said. "You are a long way from home, Mrs. Hawthorne. Pretty country up at the ridge. Wild country. Hard winter. A lot of accidents happen out there. A young woman alone could get lost in weather like this, fall down a creek bank, freeze to death before anyone found her. I would not want to think on it." The room went still. Caleb did not move. It was Wendell at the end of the bar who answered. His voice was low, almost soft. "Mr. Renfro," he said, "you have just made a serious mistake." Renfro looked at him. Wendell smiled. It was not a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a man who had spent 3 years of his life lying in cold ditches and watching other men through the long brass scope of a rifle, and Renfro, who knew the look of such men, lost some of the easy slouch in his shoulders. "If anything happens to my brother's wife," Wendell said, "I will not come into town to discuss it. I will not write you a letter. I will be standing at 300 yards on a rise above your bunkhouse one cold morning, and I will not miss. You have my word on it." Renfro held his gaze a long moment. Then he turned back to Caleb. "You have 3 days," he said. "After that, I cannot be answerable for what comes next." Caleb laid a single silver dollar on the bar in front of him. "Coffee," he said to the bartender for the lady. "We will sit by the window." He took Eleanor's arm and walked her deliberately the length of the room, past Renfro, past the staring tables, to a clean table by the front window, where he pulled out her chair and sat her down with the unhurried courtesy of a man at a Sunday dinner. He sat across from her. The coffee came. Caleb sipped his and looked out the window at the street, and his face was so calm that no one looking at him would have known how close they all had just come. When they walked out half an hour later, Sterling Renfro was gone from the bar. Eleanor did not stop trembling until they were 2 miles back up the road toward home. That was on the 17th of March. The bear came on the 23rd. Wendell had ridden out into the high country with Augustus Macaulay to set traps along the upper creek where the marten and the fox came down to drink in the late winter. 3 days passed. Then 4. They had said 3 days. On the 4th night, Augustus came riding down hard out of the dark. His pony lathered his face white, and he leaned in his saddle at the porch and said only, "Caleb, Wendell is hurt. Bad. Hawthorne get a wagon. There's a grizzly that did not know it was supposed to be sleeping. They went up at dawn. Caleb and Jasper on horseback, Eleanor and Mose in the wagon with blankets and clean linen, and a kettle of broth wrapped in cloths to keep it warm. The trail climbed for 3 hours up a steep canyon, and at the top of the canyon, in a shallow cave under an overhanging rock, they found Wendell. He had killed the bear. The carcass lay 6 feet outside the cave mouth, an old male grizzly with a torn ear and a yellow scar across its muzzle, woken too early from the long sleep, lean and starving and mean. Wendell had put 4 shots into it before the last shot, and the last shot had been close enough that there was powder burn on the bear's hide. He had crawled into the cave afterward. Augustus had found him there. His left thigh had been laid open from hip to knee. The big muscles of the leg were torn. He had lost a great deal of blood. There were 4 long claw furrows across his chest, deep enough that Eleanor could see the white shine of bone in one of them. He was not conscious when they reached him. He was burning with the first heat of fever. His lips were cracked. He had stopped shivering, which was the worst sign of all. They got him onto the wagon. They got him home. For 4 days and 4 nights, Eleanor did not sleep more than an hour at a time. She closed the wounds. She did not have a doctor. She had her father's old medical herbal and a steady hand, and the knowledge of 100 plants she had read about in a journal in Boston without ever quite imagining she would use them. She made a poultice of yarrow and comfrey root. She boiled willow bark for the fever. She kept the wounds clean, washing them every 6 hours with water that had been boiled and cooled, and she stitched the worst of the chest wounds shut with horsehair from Midnight Cavalier's Tale, because that was what her father's book had said the old country doctors had done before there were sutures. She read Walter Scott aloud to him through the long blue hours of the night. She did not know if he could hear. Ivanhoe. The pages she could find in the dim light of the lamp. She read because her father had once told her when she was small and ill that the human voice could carry a person back through the dark, and that the worst thing for a sick mind was silence. On the third night, near 3 in the morning, Wendell opened his eyes. The lamp was low. The fire in the small stove had burned down. Eleanor had been reading without seeing the words, her voice rough, her eyes near closing. She felt his hand move on the quilt, and she set the book down. Wendell looked up at her. His pale amber eyes were fever bright. He did not seem to see her exactly. He seemed to be seeing through her a long way back. "Hester," he said. His voice was a whisper. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She laid her hand very gently against his hot forehead. "It is Eleanor," she said softly. "You are at the ridge. You are safe." Wendell looked at her. Some part of him began to come back into his eyes. "Why," he said, "why are you still here?" "Because she said you are my family now." He looked at her for a long time. Then his eyes slid shut. His breathing slowed and deepened. The fever broke that night some time before dawn. Eleanor did not realize until the gray light began to come up in the small window that she had been holding his hand for 2 hours. When Wendell came down to the kitchen for the first time 6 days later, leaning on Caleb's arm and white as the linen on the table, he stopped at the foot of the stairs. He looked across the room at Eleanor, who was kneading bread. "Sister," he said. He had not called her that before. He had not called her anything before. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. She did not trust her voice. He nodded to her once the way one soldier nods to another, then he let Caleb help him to a chair. After that, the house was different. Spring began to break the back of the winter at the end of March. The icicles dripped from the eaves. Patches of brown earth showed through the snow where the south slope of the valley caught the afternoon sun. The sound of the river changed, deepened. One morning, Eleanor heard a meadowlark for the first time in her life. She was standing in the south yard hanging a sheet on the line when Jasper came riding in from Stillwater Creek with the mail. He swung down off his horse and crossed to her, and she could see in the way he held the letter in his hand that he was bringing news he did not know how to deliver. "It is from Mr. Ainsworth," he said. "There is a United States Marshal at the station. He came in this morning on the train. He is asking after 3 brothers who run cattle in a mountain valley." Eleanor took the letter. Her hands were steady. She had been waiting for this in some quiet corner of herself since the night in the cellar. "Crane," she said. Jasper nodded. "Find your brothers," she said gently. "And Mose. Send word up to Augustus. We will have a council in the kitchen in 1 hour." The 4 men sat at the table, Caleb at the head, Wendell still pale, wrapped in a shawl Eleanor had insisted on. Jasper, Mose, Augustus, Macaulay. Eleanor at the foot. Wendell wanted to ride for Canada. Jasper said he was tired of running and he was not running again. Caleb said he would not leave the land. Augustus Macaulay said the mountains were a fine place to disappear into for a man who knew them, and he could disappear all of them if it came to that, but that he was an old man, and old men preferred not to disappear if there was a better way. Eleanor said, "Listen to yourselves." They turned to her. "She said you have been running for 6 years. Has it worked? Marshal Crane is here. Whitlock is at our door. The reason this man Crane has been on your trail for 6 years is that you have been silent, and silence looks like guilt. It is time to stop running. Not with a gun, with the truth." Caleb said Eleanor the truth is hanging on a federal warrant. She said the truth is not on the warrant. The warrant is a story. The truth is in Texas. The truth is that there were 6 men who came onto your father's place and killed your family, and that those 6 men were faced and answered, and that the law of Comanche County was a lie. There must be witnesses to that truth. There must be someone somewhere who saw what happened that day in 1870 and lived. We must find that person. We must put their statement in the hand of Marshal Bram Crane, and we must do it before this Whitlock business comes to a fight, because if it comes to a fight before the federal matter is settled, it will not matter who is right and who is wrong. It will only matter that the Hawthorns were already wanted men. She drew a breath. "I will go to Stillwater Creek," she said. "Tomorrow. Alone if need be. I am not on any warrant. I can send wires. I can ask after a witness in Texas. I can meet this Marshal Crane face to face and judge for myself what kind of man he is. The four of you cannot. I can." There was a long silence. Caleb said, "I do not want you to go alone." She said, "I do not want to be alone, but I do want to go. Send Jasper down with me. Let him stay at the boarding house. Let him be near, but let me speak with the marshal. Let me try." Wendell said very quietly, "Do as my sister says." It was the first time he had spoken in council that way. Caleb looked at him, then he looked at her, then he nodded. She rode for Stillwater Creek the next morning at first light. She put up at Mrs. Henrietta Holling's boarding house under her own name, Eleanor Hawthorne, and she did not hide. At the telegraph office, she sent 2 wires. One to the sheriff of Comanche County, Texas, asking after any surviving member of the household of Jacob Bramwell of the year 1870. One to Professor Henry Sterling at Harvard, asking for the name of any frontier attorney of good standing he could recommend in the Wyoming Territory. She paid in coin. She walked out into the bright, cold morning and crossed the street to the office of Sheriff Roderick Beasley, and she introduced herself to the sheriff as Mrs. Caleb Hawthorne of the Ridge, and she asked politely where she might find the United States Marshal who was visiting the town. The marshal was in Mrs. Whitlock's tea room. Eleanor walked there alone. Bram Crane was 30 years old, tall with black hair and gray eyes, and the slightly tired face of a man who had spent his adult life carrying a question he could not put down. He stood when she came in. He saw her, took her in, and his expression sharpened in a way she had been expecting. "Marshal," she said, "I am Eleanor Hawthorne. I believe you and I have a great deal to talk about." She sat across from him. She drank her tea. She let him speak first. He spoke carefully. He told her plainly that he believed her husband and his brothers were the Bramwell brothers of Comanche County, Texas, and that they were wanted men. He told her plainly that he had been hunting them for 6 years. He told her plainly that his father, Asa Crane, had been killed in Amarillo in October of 1875, and that his father had been in his belief a victim and not a perpetrator. He laid out the story he had been told. The story of attacks on his father's cattle drives. The story of a feud that the Bramwells had begun. The story of his father Asa riding to the Bramwell place to talk and finding himself attacked and his men forced to defend themselves. The story of a 14-year-old girl who had picked up a rifle and shot 2 men of Crane's and who had been killed in the fighting that followed. The story of a vengeance hunt that had lasted 5 years and ended on the dirt of Amarillo. Eleanor listened. When he had finished, she said, "Marshal, may I ask you a question?" He nodded. She said, "How old were you when your father told you that story?" There was a pause. "I do not remember exactly," he said. "He told me parts of it for years. The whole of it, I suppose, when I was 24. After the events of 1870. I was not in Texas at the time. I was a deputy in Kansas riding for the territorial government. So she said gently, "You heard it from him alone. You did not hear it from anyone in the household. You did not hear it from the men of the county. You did not hear it from any sheriff except his." Bram Crane was very still. "There was a housekeeper," he said slowly, "a woman named Adelaide Briggs. She had been with the Bramwells for many years. My father said she had been threatened by the Bramwell sons after the fight and had fled the country. I never sought her out. I assumed she was dead or hiding." Eleanor said, "And have you, in the 6 years since your father died, ever once asked yourself whether your father, who was a powerful and proud man, might have lied to his only son?" Bram Crane did not answer. She did not press him. She finished her tea. She set the cup down. She stood up. "Marshall," she said, "I believe you are an honest man. I believe my husband is also an honest man. I believe there is a story between you that has not yet been heard, and I believe it is past time to hear it. I am sending wires today to find anyone who survived from the Bramwell household of 1870. If I find such a witness, I will bring you their account. Until I do, I would ask you as a man of law not to act on a story that you yourself have just admitted you have only heard from one mouth." She walked out. She did not look back. 3 days later, the wires came back from Texas. Adelaide Briggs was alive. She was 80 years old, living with her widowed daughter at number 14 Hickory Lane in Austin. She remembered every minute of April of 1870. She would speak. The wires came back from Boston, too. Professor Henry Sterling had not forgotten her father. He had not forgotten her. He had wired ahead to a frontier attorney named Mr. Carrington in Cheyenne, who would meet with them at any hour and represent them without fee on Sterling's word and Sterling's purse. Sterling himself would come west if she needed him in any season. Eleanor held the 2 telegrams in her hand at the kitchen table and read them aloud to the men and Caleb when she had finished, set his coffee down and went outside and stood for a long time on the porch with his back to the door, and Eleanor did not follow him because she understood that there were ways a man like Caleb Bramwell needed to weep, and that none of them included being seen. Marshall Bram Crane rode up the valley alone 2 days later. He came without backup. He came with his rifle in its scabbard, and both his gloved hands held open at his sides as he walked his horse the last 100 yards to the porch. And Caleb Hawthorne, who had spent 6 years preparing for this man's arrival, watched him come and lowered the rifle in his own hands. They sat at the long pine table in the Hawthorne kitchen. Eleanor poured the coffee. Caleb spoke for the first time in 6 years to a man outside his own household, and he spoke the whole of it. The ride to Fort Worth, the yard at dawn, the 6 names, the 2 who had laid down their arms, the 4 who had not, the street in Amarillo, the federal warrant, the flight north. He did not soften any of it. He did not ask for anything. Bram Crane listened without speaking. When Caleb was finished, the marshal rose and crossed to the window and stood looking out at the mountains for a long time. Then he turned. "I will ride to Texas with you," he said. "I will take the witness statement in my own hand. If your story holds, I will carry it to the federal bench in Cheyenne and ask that the warrants be vacated. A man of law should have done that 6 years ago. I will do it now." He stayed the night in the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. That was the room he was sleeping in when 2 hours before dawn, old Banjo's growling brought the household to its feet. Sterling Renfro had come back alone. He had meant to fire the barn. He had brought lamp oil and a lantern, and he had been working his way along the east wall when the dog had gotten his scent and sounded the house. Mose had come out onto the porch and shouted, and Renfro had drawn and fired. The bullet had cut through the soft flesh of Mose's left shoulder and gone on into the porch rail behind him. Mose had gone down, but he had gone down shooting. Caleb came around the corner of the house with his Colt drawn. Renfro fired again. He missed. Wendell on the second-floor balcony had not missed. He shot the lantern out of Renfro's hand at 20 yards. He shot again, and Renfro fell. He was dead before Caleb reached him. Marshal Bram Crane came down in his shirt and his trousers with his marshal's badge in his hand, and he stood beside Caleb in the lantern light over the body of Sterling Renfro, and he said for any witness who cared to hear it, this man fired first. This man came onto private property at 2 a.m. with intent to commit arson. This man was answered in lawful self-defense. I am United States Marshal Bram Crane, and I will say so under oath in any court in this territory. The next morning, Sheriff Beasley came up to the ridge with 3 deputies and a warrant. He arrested Cyrus Whitlock at his ranch house before noon on the charge of conspiracy to threaten a federal officer and the hiring of armed men for the purpose of intimidation. Whitlock, when he understood that a U.S. Marshal would be testifying against him, went very gray and said nothing at all. The Whitlock spread under federal pressure and lawyers' bills, and the absence of its master was put up for partial sale that summer. Caleb bought 5,000 acres of it at fair market price, which doubled the size of Hawthorne Ridge and gave the brothers good control of the lower watershed of the Bighorn drainage. Whitlock himself went to the Territorial Penitentiary for 5 years. That was in late March of 1876. By the second week of April, 4 of them were on a southbound train: Caleb, Wendell, Jasper, Eleanor. With them in the next car traveled United States Marshal Bram Crane. The journey took 3 weeks. Somewhere in Kansas, on a long, slow afternoon in the smoking car, Wendell drew an envelope from his coat pocket and laid it on the small table between himself and Bram Crane. Inside were 11 names, 11 small ranchers, dirt farmers, widows with 1 good water seep, who had been ruined, run off, or killed in Comanche County, Texas, between 1865 and 1870. Wendell had been collecting the names for years. Bram Crane read the list. He read it twice. He looked out the window for a long time. Then he folded the list and put it in his own coat, and he did not speak for the next 100 miles. In Austin, they found number 14 Hickory Lane. They found a small adobe house with a green door and a white-haired woman of 80 in a black shawl who opened the door and saw Caleb on her doorstep and put her hand to her mouth. "Master Caleb," she said, "Mother of God, it is you." Adelaide Briggs sat them down at her small kitchen table and told them what she had been waiting 6 years to tell. She told them that she had been at the market in town when the Crane men had come. She told them that she had come back to find the house in flames and her family dead. She told them that she had hidden in the brush and watched 6 men led by Asa Crane ride away. She named them, every one. Then she rose and went to a small chest in the corner of her bedroom and brought back 2 folded sheets of paper brown with age. They were letters, threatening letters. Each was signed by Asa Crane in his own hand, and each promised in plain terms that if the Bramwell place was not sold by the summer of 1870, no member of the family would live to see the autumn. She had taken them from her master's Bible the night of the burial. She had kept them 6 years. Bram Crane, when he read them, laid them very gently back down on the table, and he put his face in his hands. "I have served my father's memory for 24 years, he said quietly, believing what he told me, defending his name. Adelaide Briggs, who had buried her own husband and her own son and 3 of her own grandchildren in her long life, reached across the small table and laid her papery hand on the marshal's shoulder. "Child," she said, "sometimes our fathers are not who we believed. That is a hard truth, but it is not yours to carry alone." The federal hearing was held in Cheyenne in early June before Judge Augustus Reed. Mrs. Adelaide Briggs traveled north to give her testimony in person, accompanied by her widowed daughter. The 2 letters were entered into evidence. The deposition of 12 witnesses to the death of Asa Crane in the streets of Amarillo was entered. The official report of United States Marshal Bram Crane, in which he wrote in his own clear hand that the events in Comanche County between 1870 and 1875 amounted to a failure of state authority of such a profound nature that the actions of the surviving Bramwell sons, while technically in violation of the law, had been carried out in the absence of any other available remedy, was entered. Caleb stood and gave his testimony plainly without ornament. He named every man he had killed. He named the 2 he had spared. He said that he had never struck a man from behind. He said he had nightmares about each of the 4 he had killed, and that he expected to have them until he died. He said he was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for the truth to be heard. He said that he had a wife now, and that he intended to build a life, and that he was prepared to accept whatever punishment the court considered just. Eleanor stood and gave her testimony last. She did not speak as a wife. She spoke as her father's daughter, the daughter of a Harvard botanist and a woman who had once grown lavender in a window box on Joy Street. She said that the law was the servant of justice and not the other way around. She said that her own aunt in Boston had used the law to steal her inheritance. She said that Asa Crane had used the law of Comanche County to ruin men and seize their land. She said that the law without justice was only a machine, and that men sometimes had to step into the place where the machine had stalled, and that the question before the court was not whether the Bramwell brothers had broken the law, but whether the law had broken first. Judge Augustus Reed listened. He retired to his chambers for 2 hours. When he came back, he said the court finds the federal warrants outstanding against Caleb Wendell and Jasper Bramwell to be vacated. The court finds that the actions in question, while irregular, fell within the long-established practice of the frontier in the absence of effective civil authority. The court further commends United States Marshal Bram Crane for his integrity in pursuing the truth even when it ran counter to his personal beliefs. The records of this case will be sealed by order of this court. The Bramwell brothers will retain their right to live in this territory under their lawful surname Hawthorne. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse in the long, bright sunlight of a Cheyenne afternoon, Bram Crane offered his hand to Caleb. "I have hated a ghost for 6 years," he said. "I have served my father's memory for 24. You have given me back the truth of him. I do not thank you for it, but I respect what you did." Caleb took the hand. "Marshal," he said, "your father did wrong. You are not your father. I hope you find your peace." Bram Crane said, "I have decided to sell the 30,000 acres my father left me in Texas. The proceeds will be divided among the families of the 11 men on Wendell's list. I do not deserve to keep that land. I will continue to wear this badge. It is the way I will pay for what my name has cost the world." He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, If you ever have need of anything that is in the power of a federal marshal to give, you have only to send a wire. I am in your debt." She said, "Marshal, find your own happiness. That is the only debt I would like you to pay." They went home. Spring became summer. The herb garden Eleanor had drawn on the kitchen table came up out of the broken earth in long, neat rows: yarrow, echinacea, comfrey, mountain mint. By the end of July, Dr. Whitmore in Stillwater Creek was buying her dried medicinals in regular quantities. By the middle of August, 2 of the neighboring ranches were sending wagons twice a month to her gate. By the first cool nights of September, she had begun to write to Professor Henry Sterling about her father's old papers, the unfinished manuscript on the wildflowers of the New England coast, and Sterling had begun to write back about the possibility of publication, posthumous, with an introduction by his daughter. In August, a Pinkerton agent named Cornelius Hodges came up the road from Stillwater Creek and stood on the porch of the Hawthorne house with his hat in his hand. He had been hired, he said, by a Mrs. Margaret Pemberton of Boston to recover both her niece and a set of pearl earrings that had been removed from the household. He was a careful man, polite professional. He listened when Eleanor produced the original letter of bequest from her grandmother Ruth Whitfield. He read the marriage certificate. He read the registered deed of Hawthorne Ridge with both names on it. He said plainly that he was satisfied. He said that he would so report to Mrs. Pemberton. He took no offense when Caleb stood behind his wife's chair and said very evenly that Eleanor Hawthorne would not be returning to Boston now or ever. Before he left, Hodges paused at the edge of the porch. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "there is one more thing you should know. Your grandmother, before she died, established a trust with the Suffolk Bank in Boston. It was set to mature on your 25th birthday or your marriage, whichever came first. Your marriage, by the laws of this territory, has now triggered it. You should write to them. The funds with interest are not inconsiderable," she wrote that night. The reply came 6 weeks later in the form of a banker's draft for $8,400. She and Caleb sat at the kitchen table and they did the arithmetic together. $2,000 to the household reserve, $3,000 to purchase another 200 acres south of the new Whitlock parcel, $1,500 to fund the publication of her father's papers and the expansion of the herb garden into a proper apothecary cottage, $1,000 for Jasper, who had begun to speak quietly of going to St. Louis for a season to study at the new veterinary college, $900 set aside for the building of a small house on the southern edge of the property in case Mrs. Adelaide Briggs should ever wish to come north and live the rest of her days where she could see the mountains. In October, a letter came from Boston. It was not from Aunt Margaret. It was from Beatrice Pemberton, who wrote that her mother had died of heart failure in May, that the great house on Beacon Street was being sold, that Cordelia had married well and forgotten everything she had ever known about the basement kitchen, and that she, Beatrice, was thinking of taking a teaching position at a girls' school in Concord. She had not written, she said, to ask anything of Eleanor. She had written to apologize. She had been a poor cousin and a cruel one. She knew that nothing she could say would alter that. She hoped only that someday, if Eleanor ever passed through Boston again, they might take tea together. She signed herself Beatrice Pemberton with no further claim than that. Eleanor read the letter twice. She did not weep. She did not feel anger. She wrote back that night in 2 short paragraphs. She forgave Beatrice, she wrote, not because she had forgotten, but because she did not wish to carry the past any longer. She would not be returning to Boston. Her life was here now, and it was a good life. She wished Beatrice happiness, the real kind, not the kind their mother had wanted for her. She sealed the letter. She set it on the hall table for the next mail run. She did not look at it again. By the end of October, Wendell came into the kitchen one afternoon while she was working at the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down. Old Banjo, asleep at her feet, did not even open his eyes. Sister Wendell said. She set down her pen. "When you came," he said, "I hated you. I thought you would destroy us. I was wrong. You saved us." You did not hate me," she said. "You were guarding us. They are different things." He looked at the table. "Hester would have grown up to be like you," he said. "I see her in you sometimes." That was the first thing I could not bear, and the last thing I could not let go of. "Wendell," she said, "you did not lose her. I am here." He nodded. He did not say more. He stood and walked out of the kitchen, and that was as much as he had ever said and as much as he ever needed to. 2 days later, he asked Caleb's leave to take a small wagon north to the cabin of Augustus Macaulay. There was a child up there, a girl of 8 years named Phoebe, Augustus's son's child. The boy and his wife had died in the yellow fever of the previous summer, and Phoebe had lived through it, and Augustus, who was past 60, had been raising her alone in his cabin in the high country. Augustus loved her, but Augustus was old, and the long winters were getting harder. Wendell had been to the cabin many times. He knew the child. He had thought about it, he told his brother, for a month. "I cannot be a father," he said, "but I can be an uncle. We have room. She can come down to us. Augustus will keep his cabin, and he will come and go. The child will have a roof and a school and a stove and a kitchen with a woman in it." Caleb said, "Only, when do you want to bring her home?" Wendell rode up the next morning. Phoebe Macaulay came to live at Hawthorne Ridge before the first snow fell. She was a small grave child with red gold hair and Augustus's pale eyes, and she was so quiet for the first 3 days that Eleanor thought she might have been struck mute by grief. On the 4th morning, Eleanor found her sitting cross-legged on the floor of the library with the Green Book of New England Wildflowers open on her lap, slowly tracing the printed names with one small finger. Eleanor sat down beside her on the floor and asked softly whether the girl could read. The girl looked up startled and said, "Yes, ma'am, my mother taught me." From that day on, Phoebe followed Eleanor through the house like a small, thoughtful shadow, and asked her the names of every plant in the garden, and Eleanor, who had never had a child to teach, found that she had been waiting all her life for this. The first frost came in late October. She had not had a regular monthly cycle since August. She had told no one. At the end of September, she had ridden quietly down to Stillwater Creek and seen Dr. Whitmore. He had been a customer of her herb garden by then for many months, and he treated her with great courtesy. He examined her. He confirmed what she had begun to suspect. He told her that her child would come in the last week of April. She did not tell Caleb at once. She wanted to choose the moment. She chose it on a Tuesday evening in the library when Caleb was reading, and she was sitting in the chair he had built for her by the fire, and old Banjo lay on the rug between them, and the wind was moving through the pines outside, and the lamp on the desk was burning low and warm. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "I have something to tell you." He set down his book. He waited. "I will be a mother," she said. "The doctor says the last week of April." He did not move for a long moment. Then he set the book aside. He came across the room. He knelt down in front of her chair, the way he had knelt the night of their wedding, to lift her hand to his lips, and he laid his forehead against the soft swell of her abdomen, where their child was growing. "Hello," he said very quietly. "Hello, child." Eleanor laid her hand on his head. His hair was warm. The lamp made a small, bright halo around them both. "We did this," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Together." Outside, somewhere in the pines, a coyote called. Old Banjo lifted his head, listened, lowered it again, and slept on. In the morning, Caleb told his brothers at breakfast. Wendell stood up, walked the length of the table, and embraced his older brother for the first time in 20 years. Jasper let out a whoop that frightened the dogs in the yard. Mose Hartwell wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and pretended he had something in them. Phoebe, sitting beside Eleanor, slipped her small hand into Eleanor's and held it tightly under the table and said very softly, "May I help take care of the baby?" Eleanor said, "You may help me take care of all the babies that come." The 18th of November, 1876, was a Sunday. It was 1 year and 1 day since Eleanor had stepped down from the train at Stillwater Creek with a trunk in her hand and $87 in the lining of her petticoat. The afternoon had been clear and cold. A light snow had begun to fall in the late afternoon, the first of the new winter. Eleanor stood on the porch of the Hawthorne house, wrapped in the gray wool shawl Caleb had given her for her 23rd birthday in October, one hand resting lightly on the slight curve of her belly. The lamps in the windows of the house glowed yellow against the early dusk. The chimney smoke went up straight in the still air. Across the yard near the corral, Wendell was crouched at Phoebe's eye level, showing her how to feed old Banjo from her own small palm without flinching. Phoebe was laughing. The hound was wagging his tail with such enthusiasm that it kept knocking his hindquarters sideways. Jasper had ridden in a quarter hour earlier from town, and he had come bringing a bolt of soft white cotton from Mr. Donnelly's store. He had married Mr. Donnelly's middle daughter, Winifred, in a small ceremony at the church in Stillwater Creek 2 weeks before, and she would be coming up to the ridge to live with them in the new year. Mose Hartwell sat on the porch step at the far end, mending a piece of harness, with the slow patience of a man who had outlived his hurry. Augustus Macaulay stood by the gate of the South Corral with a freshly dressed deer slung over his shoulder, talking to Caleb about the meat and the weather. Caleb. He was riding in from the south pasture on Midnight Cavalier, a long, dark figure on a long, dark horse, the orange light of the late sun catching in his hair. He saw her on the porch. He raised one gloved hand. She raised hers in answer. She thought as she stood there of all the things her aunt had told her she was: plain, a burden, useful at best, pitiable at worst. She thought of the laughing women in the parlor on Beacon Street. She thought of the cold hands of Edwin Thatcher. She thought of the snow at the Boston station at 3 in the morning, and of the $87 in her petticoat, and of the small weight of her father's journal in her trunk. A year ago today she had thought she was running away. She knew now that she had been running toward. The choosing had never belonged to anyone else. The choosing had always been hers. Caleb Hawthorne had given her the right to make it, but he had not made it for her. She had made it. On every morning of every day since she stepped off the train. She would make it again tomorrow. She would make it every day for the rest of her life. Caleb pulled up at the bottom of the porch steps. He swung down from Midnight Cavalier. He came up onto the porch, and he stopped 1 step below her so that their faces were level. "You are well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am well," she said. He laid his palm gently against the soft curve of her belly. "The child," he said. "The child kicked last night," she said, for the first time. I felt it. He went down on one knee, the way he had in the library. He put his ear lightly against her dress. His hat fell off into the snow on the step beside him. He did not pick it up. "Hello," he said. "Hello again." She put her hand in his hair. She watched the snow fall on his shoulders. She watched Wendell laughing in the yard with a small girl who had become their family. She watched Jasper carrying a parcel up the path. She watched Mose, his face soft in the lamplight from the kitchen window. She watched Augustus Macaulay, ancient and kind, leaning on the gate of his world. "Caleb," she said. He looked up at her. "We did it," she said. He stood up. He did not pick up his hat. He drew her into his arms very carefully, the way a man holds something that is more than himself. The snow fell on them both. "Yes," he said into her hair. "Together." The light in the upstairs window was a small, steady gold against the deep blue of the early evening. Inside, the fire in the great stone hearth burned warm. The kettle was on the stove. The family was home. In the high country, far above them, a single coyote called once into the cold, and was answered again, and the long, quiet conversation of the mountains went on, the way it had gone on for 1,000 winters before this one, the way it would go on for 1,000 winters after. Hawthorne Ridge settled into the night. So did Eleanor. She had been unchosen all her life. She was chosen now by herself. That was the difference. That was everything. That was the whole of the story.